But the other thing is we have to continue, we can't get tired of talking about the outrage. I know sometimes it's like we just talk about outrage and we can't do anything. But the reality is we do have certain powers. We should use the oversight powers. I still remember, I was the first member of Congress to go into a federal prison where over 200 moms and dads
Praise is Adonai, who is to be praised forever. Okay, and you've got, I just pointed out, you have Baruch, Baruch is Baruch, and Hamivorach, we'll talk a little bit about, but you can see I highlighted the Vorach, it's the same word as Baruch. Okay, it's sort of the passive form of Baruch. Okay, they translated who is to be praised, but I'll go through that with you a little bit. So I want to have, let's see, Gail, would you read us reading number 1 there?
Hold on a second. A story is told of a father waking his son up to go to shul on Shabbat morning. To his chagrin, the son seems to be in a comatose state of Shabbos Menucha. The father exclaims, "You had better be in shul by Baruch Hu." The father arrives to shul. He davens Pesukei Zimra and does not see his son. Shacharit begins and the son is nowhere to be found. Baruch Hu comes and goes and the son hasn't arrived. 30 minutes later, during the latter section of the Torah reading, the son walks proudly into shul, sits down joyfully next to his father, only to find his father disgruntled and frustrated. The father turns angrily towards the son and says, "Where were you? I told you that you had to be here by Baruch Hu." The son answers, "You did not say which Baruch Hu. There are still a few Baruch Hus left in the Torah reading."
Okay. So the message being that it shows up throughout. Okay, it's not a one-time thing. It happens several times in our service. You have it every morning after Yishavach as you begin the Shacharit service. You have it before every Aliyah in the Torah reading. And you also have it in Mariv as we begin the service in the evening. So it permeates our service in its form. All right. Additionally, Halakha says that if you were to miss the morning Baruch Hu, you come in later. At the end of the service, as long as there's still a minyan there, you can say it to yourself. So the rabbis obviously were building it throughout, and you had this opportunity, one way or another, you're going to get these words out. Now, what's important to understand here is that most of the preliminary service, most of what we do prior to Baruch Hu, until 1,500 years ago, was recited at home prior to attending the synagogue service. And that's why we refer to it as a call to prayer. In other words, everybody was at home. They'd show up for services after doing their preliminary stuff, and they'd call everybody, "Okay, no, let's pray." That's what Baruch Hu's functionally served as. Okay? we can trace this ancient call, the words that we actually use to bless the Lord, back to temple days. Then as now, when the call to worship would happen, people would say, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Praise, blessed is the Lord who is to be praised forever and ever. That seems to be the common response since temple days. If you look in the Zohar, it states that all sacred acts require a summoning, explaining the need for Baruch Hu. It's also done. We have a call in. You have shir in the Birkat Hamazon. You have Rabotai Nivarech. You have this call to worshiping. A lot of the prayers, I bet most people don't do it, but if you look in the Haggadah, there's this constant repetitive phrase in traditional text, Hineni Muchan Umezuman. And then Naomi, I see your question, which is, let us begin, let us get ready for this mitzvah. Yes, Naomi.
I as an Israeli, I think your pronunciation is confusing. It's Baruch Hu, not Baruch Hu, because Baruch Hu, for my ears, means blessed is he, and Baruch Hu is an imperative, bless.
Fair enough. Okay, so the shva has to be a silent shva.
Yes.
Fair enough. Good. I love it. Thank you. That makes perfect sense. I appreciate it. It's good to have Hebrew experts sitting amongst us, and this is great. All right. So the leader invites everybody to join him in the blessings by saying Baruch Hu. All right. And to this invitation, the worshipers respond Baruch with the second line. Now, what is important by Jewish tradition is that the leader cannot exclude himself from the circle of worshipers, even if only in appearance alone. And therefore, any time Baruch Hu is said and the congregation responds, the leader or the person having the blessings must repeat that second line. You see this a lot with the people who get called to the Torah. They're not sure. All right. So I'm telling you now, yes, you have to repeat that second line as a way of saying, I too am part of the kahal. I too am part of the community. So the other thing to note is Baruch Hu requires, like Kaddish, requires a minyan. If you don't have a quorum, you can't have a call to the community. Of all prayers, it makes most sense here. You can't call a community together if you don't have a community. And by Jewish definition, that is a minyan, that is 10. And it's based on, as we've talked about, a number of biblical precedences. When the Shliach Tzibor says Baruch Hu, he bows slightly from the waist, not the whole congregation. I don't know where this, I've seen this at Brit Shalom. It's the first time I've ever seen it, where when the leader says Baruch Hu, a lot of people bend. You don't. It's just the leader. When the congregation responds Baruch, then they bend. It's only when you're saying the words. Okay, so let me clarify that. If I'm davening and I say the first line, I bow, you don't. When you say the second line and you're saying the words, you bow. When I repeat and I'm saying the words the second line, I bow. So it's only when you are saying the words, you bow. The term Baruch, as we've talked about before, is originally derived from the word berech, knee. And it reflects the historical precedent and practice of dropping to one's knees before a monarch to acknowledge his or her sovereignty. All right, and so if we refer to God as Melech Malchei HaMelachim, as the King of all kings, all the more so. Kal v'chomer. We also know that this tradition of standing and bowing for Baruch Hu is ancient, as shown in a verse in Nehemiah, which is probably the 4th century before the Common Era. It says, then the Levites said, stand up and bless the Lord your God. All right. The goal as you begin the service is to acknowledge God's rulership here and to transcend that which we walk into the sanctuary with, which is a self-centered view of the world and a sense of my needs. And the whole goal of the service is to get you out of yourself and to focus on God and the larger world and to make your needs less important. We're focusing on God and the larger picture. I've said that a number of times. I can't emphasize that enough. If the goal of coming to services is to make myself feel better, you've missed. You've missed. Okay? The Torah defines idolatry as the view that my strength and the power of my hand accomplish all these things. And so instead, we adopt a humble attitude that forces us to confront the fact, and this is difficult, we're not in control of our own lives. Plain and simply, we're not. And there are moments that's thrown in our face. We depend on God for many things, and therefore God can deprive us of many things at will. And so Baruch Hu evokes a certain sense of awe. We begin the service by turning to God with a recognition of our own limitations. Okay. So the next question is, how can a human being extend a blessing to God? God is the source of blessings. How do we bless God? It seems a bizarre concept. And the fact that the biblical people blessed God, even knowing that God was the source of all blessings, reflects what Moshe Greenberg calls the social analogy in religious traditions. Essentially, God is typically understood by analogy. We can't understand God on his own terms. We understand him and through human institutions. All right? Attributes typical of those institutions are then projected onto others, even if they don't make sense. So if we can bless our family members and they can bless us, if subjects can bless a king, we end up doing that which we have nothing else to do. We bless God, one who cannot benefit from those blessings. And that is implied. Now, I wanted to go back to the translation, the inappropriateness of translating this, who is to be blessed. Because it really isn't, that's not what it's saying. Hamivorach is really saying, who is blessed? He's already blessed. So we're blessing that which is already blessed. It's already in a state of blessedness, meaning God. There's nothing we can add to it, but we add our words, and that's all we can do. God, by definition, is that which is blessed. Okay? Yes, good, we're good? All right, flip the page. You have here Shema and its blessings. And I want to go through a little bit and review how the structure of the service has functioned thus far and where we're going. Thus far, we've had the Pesukei de Zimra and Birchot HaShachar and Pesukei de Zimra. We've had the two preliminary sections of the prayer book. Both of them were aimed at creating a mindset so that we could walk in at this point and focus fully on God and our relationship with God. We've gone through blessings, we've gone through biblical readings, we've talked about God's role in the universe, and so we are now ready to engage in prayer. And so we reach the Baruch Hu, the call to worship, and then we get to the section known as Shema and its blessings. And what I've listed out here is what are the components of that. So we start out as God as the continuous creator. The first blessing is God as Yotzer, as creator. Okay, we'll talk about that at length. The second blessing is God as revealer, as revealing of Torah. God's love of Israel is expressed through the giving of Torah, which is a document which enables meaningful life. That's the intent of the rabbis. You then come across the line of Shema, the unity of God. The first paragraph of Shema talks about love and devotion to God. The second paragraph is reward and punishment in the world. The third paragraph is the duty of observing God's commandments. So you have love of God, you have reward and punishment, and then the obligations that we have to observe. And then finally, the blessing that follows the Shema is one of Ge'ulah, redeeming, redemption. God is a redeemer in the past. We talk about the redemption from Egypt, and we talk about ultimate redemption in the days of Messiah. So that's the structure of the Shema and its blessings. And believe it or not, we're going to spend the entire rest of the time on the words of the next blessing here. Actually, one word. Okay? So I want to read you this blessing. I want to read it to you in Hebrew and then the English. They all start out, Baruch Atah Adonai. Praise or blessed are you, Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, King or Sovereign of the universe, to degenderize it. Yotzer, or who forms light, Uvorei choshech, and creates darkness. So you have opposites here, forming light, creating darkness. Okay? You then have Oseh Shalom, who makes peace. And what should follow that thematically? All right. What's the opposite of peace? We'll talk about that in a second. It's a rhetorical. But what follows in the prayer book is not the opposite. It says uvorei et hakol, who creates everything. All right. Lovely. Okay. Except for the fact that the last word is a direct quotation from Isaiah 45, which is exactly the same except for the last word. In Isaiah 45, it ends, Oseh Shalom, who makes peace, uvorei et hara, and who creates evil. It's the opposite of shalom. Now, obviously, the rabbis played with this and they were uncomfortable. It raised too many questions. And so they made it a more global statement, which doesn't deny the creation of evil, but it makes it more generic and less in your face. Okay? So actually, if you were to really translate this, Ra normally means evil. But what is the opposite of shalom? Shalom really means harmony, tranquility. And so a better translation for Ra in this particular case might be, what do you call it? Chaos. Okay, it's the opposite of everything being in order as it should be. Shalom and harmony and tranquility. It's that opposite meaning. It's what it really translates out here, even though because there's a poetic nature to what's going on. One more thing to note here, and that is this blessing. When we say this blessing, and you see in our congregation, nobody knows what to do again. You're supposed to sit prior to saying this blessing. Why? At the rabbi, according to the Shulchan Aruch, because it's communicating that the blessing is actually part of the blessing that follows, not connected to the Baruch Hu. So since you're going to sit for the blessing, you sit for this beginning, opening of it. All right? So you finish Baruch Hu and you sit down. All right, so now let's start to take this apart. So this opening bracha praises God as the creator of both light and darkness. It's here because it is a deliberate response to the belief of Persian dualism. The Jews at this time were living in the time of the Second Temple, and were living amongst the Persians. The Persians believed in a God of dark and a God of light, and so you had two gods. And so this is a deliberate refutation of that. And think about it. What is this part of? The Shema and its blessings. What's the message of Shema? One God. So what's the appropriate message of the opening blessing to the section? One God. Okay? It not uvore, not God, a God of light and a God of darkness, but a God who creates both. Okay? It makes perfect sense within the context of what we're doing here. All right. Obviously, this is revolutionary for us. It's the norm. We live in a world where most of the people, certainly in our immediate environment, are monotheists. But in the ancient world, that wasn't the case. You know, they believed certainly in gods of darkness, gods of light, gods of wind and sun, and good fortune and bad fortune. We know from Greek history, we know from Roman history, the multiple gods, and they were constantly in battle with one another. And for Jews, that wasn't working. Israel persisted in teaching that God is the God who created the heavenly bodies and endowed them with powers. We get to El Adon. That is the larger message of El Adon. It talks about the sun and the moon rising, but it goes out of its way to say they're nothing more than formations of God. It's making a deliberate point of it. So how do we deal with this? If you only have one God, and you have a God who is all good, how do you understand the existence of evil? Okay, it's disturbing. Why would God permit evil? Now, let me tell you in advance, I'm going to give you a series of Jewish responses, and I'm going to tell you in advance, I don't have the answer. I have answers, which tells you there's no answer. All right, so I'm telling you that in advance. The existence of evil has provided the most serious impediment to faith in all religions, right? It's why Christianity took the concept of a Yetzer Hara, a Satan, an evil inclination that we have within us, and externalized it into Satan. It's convenient. It's a playoff of Persian dualism without having to say it's dualism. All right? Given the enormity in our world, though, of the horrors of the Holocaust, the destructive capabilities that we have represented by Hiroshima, this has taken on a terrifying reality in our world. Nuclear threats remain, genocides continue. How do we live in a world and make sense of it? That's the challenge before us. And the reality of it is, we must realize that no theology, there's no kind of philosophy, there's no theology that is going to ever justify the mass slaughter of blameless, the death of a single child, or the seeming randomness with which nature and disaster strikes. We're not going to come up with a perfect answer to this. So let's look at what we can come up with. There are some segments of evil that we can try to understand, specifically suffering caused by one human being to another. And I know that's just an element of it. I'm not trying to address all of it. That's an element. And Jewish understanding says that by creating human beings with free will, God makes a choice. God makes a choice to limit himself. It's not that God can't. It's that God made the choice, the same way a parent makes a choice to limit their authority at a certain point with a child so that the child can grow. All right? An example of that. You take a little one and you teach them not to cross the street without looking. Okay? Now, again, there's reward and punishment, and we get that. You can get run over if you cross the street, not cross the street. If you tie your child to the tree and then tell him not to cross the street, you've eliminated free will. And there's no real lesson being taught. At some point, nonetheless, we know adults get hit by cars and get run over. At some point, the parent has to say, you're on your own. You're not going to stand there with a 25-year-old and say, don't cross the street. It doesn't work. I don't have to tell you that, okay? We have to give them the freedom to make their own mistakes, or the world doesn't work. There's no growth and there's no maturing. And as a result, we see this gift of free will as an act of divine love, like a parent. All right? There's a wonderful book by Alan Dershowitz called The Genesis of Justice. He describes the book of Genesis as God learning. If you look at the story of creation and then you go to Cain and Abel, God says, if you kill, you will die. Cain kills Abel, and guess what? Cain doesn't die. God decides, I'll be lenient. We'll make his life a little bit more difficult. Well, parents do that. You get a generation later, a couple generations later, God destroys everything with a flood. He overcompensates. Just like a parent who goes to the other extreme. And you see God trying out different models of justice. He gets to the story with Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah, and he negotiates it through with Abraham. You see as God, this is Dershowitz's writing. I'm not going to tell you it's absolute theology. But Dershowitz describes God as a learning God, like a parent is a learning parent. There's no book on how to be a parent. We all know there are books, but they give you gists. They don't give you the realities of parenting. Okay? And so it is with God. In order for us to have free will, God has to limit himself and has to play the role of parent who says go. And with that comes the potential for man mistreating man in the world. Despite this gift of free will, God Jewish tradition is depicting God as a caring parent, and so he pleads with us to do the right thing. He cajoles us, he cautions us, he threatens us, but he stops short of forcing us. All right? So that's one perspective. Okay? And that is human suffering caused by human beings. And so we can understand that to some degree. I'm not going to, again, we all can find examples outside of it. Other forms of evil, outside of human cause, strike us with a sense of inadequacy of understanding. We simply can't get there. We want to know why nature itself is so constructed that it can produce cancer, AIDS, COVID-19. Why? Not how, but why is nature structured like that? Or why does a 7-year-old suddenly develop a life-threatening disease? Why are people killed in hurricanes, tidal waves, and tornadoes, and not others? The why is the problem. And the Jewish formulation on that question is essentially, why do the righteous suffer and why do the evil prosper? So the issue is essentially God's alleged justice. That's what we call theodicy. Theodicy is looking at God's justice in the world. We have this impulse as human beings to pursue theodicy because we're driven. Everything we do in our life is really sense-making. I get a new piece of information. How does it fit into my existing schemata, into my existing understandings of the world? How do I make it work? How do I turn the world into a meaningful whole? Right? That's how we live our lives. When we think somebody is a jerk and they do something nice, we're left with a struggle. Is this aberrant? Is it a new behavior? How do I make sense of it? And vice versa too. When somebody nice does something jerky, how do I make? We spend our lives making sense of our planet and our world. So with evil, the challenge is two-dimensional. On one level, it's intellectual. We want to fully understand and comprehend how God's justice can be reconciled with suffering. We want to answers to questions posed by the mind. On a second level, the challenge is more existential. How do we cope with suffering? How do we go on living in the face of pain? And by and large, no religious tradition has been able to deal with the intellectual problem in full. Nobody's come up with that answer. But every tradition has come up with an experiential way of helping people handle pain. And in general, the less adequate our cognitive responses are, the more valuable the experiential responses are. And we all understand this. It doesn't necessarily work all the time. I will tell you, when I applied to rabbinical school, I had an interview with Rabbi Brad Artson. And Brad Artson had been the rabbi in the synagogue where I was working at the time. And the synagogue was going out of business. His question to me was, how do I explain that? I knew what he was looking for. I didn't answer it the way my heart told me. I knew what he wanted. And so I said to him, I answer that in the ways people are helping one another through this process, the way people are helping one another cope through the suffering of the loss of their synagogue. That is one Jewish response. Now, whether he knew that I was giving him what he wanted to hear, or I was giving, because I don't know the answer. That's the only answer I could come up with. Doesn't mean it satisfied me. Okay? So that is one response, is we deal with the existential component when we can't come up with a cognitive response. All right. I know nobody's happy yet. I haven't given you the answers you're looking for. Let's continue on. All right. The Bible. Anytime, again, we have a problem, where's the first place we turn? We turn to the Tanakh. The classical explanation for suffering in the Bible, with the notable exception of the book of Job, which we will deal with, is that God's punishment is a response to the sins of the community, not the individual, the community. Deuteronomy, the second paragraph of the Shema, which, mind you, listen, realize, we sing the first paragraph of the Shema, we sing the third paragraph of the Shema, we do the second paragraph silently. It's not an accident. There's a theology here that is uncomfortable. And so we don't do it out loud. What does it say essentially? If we obey God, we will be blessed. And if we rebel, we will be punished by all kinds of suffering, military defeat, exile, plague, famine, no rain. Okay? It's clear. If the community is good, you get prizes. If the community is bad, you get slapped. That's the message that's clear in that paragraph. It's not an accident we do it silently. We don't want to confront that regularly. It's why the rabbis changed hara, the evil, to hakol. All right, to everything. It's still there, we just de-emphasize it. It plays out in rabbinic literature as well, because it showed up in our prayer books. It shows up on the musafs, in the musaf service of the festivals. There's a section we tend to omit that says, because of our sins, we were exiled. If you look in a Reconstructionist prayer book, that is gone. Kaplan got rid of it. When I was at Shereth Israel, I was in one of the alternative services for the holidays, and Joe Menashe was the rabbi. His wife was the great-granddaughter of Kaplan. And he looked at me and said to me, if you say those words, my wife is going to hit me. Okay? We tend to skip those words because it's an uncomfortable theology. Ultimately, Jews have understood exile as we live for 2,000 years as the paradigmatic, specifically Jewish form of suffering. It's distance from God. Keep going. Sometimes God's punishment takes the form of a withdrawal of his protective concern over Israel. When God withdraws, by this definition, the community becomes vulnerable, okay? And that seems to be the meaning of the often repeated biblical reference to God hiding his face, right? Why doesn't the parent leave a 4-year-old and go off and play bingo? Because you recognize the child will be vulnerable. You can leave your 15-year-old, although you might have parties in your house when you come back, okay? But your 4-year-old is extremely vulnerable. When God withdraws, one of the understandings is God is hiding in his face, and therefore the people become vulnerable. By and large, this entire process of retribution, of vulnerability, works because the Bible applies it to the fate of the community as a whole, not the individual. All right? In much of the Bible, the destiny of the individual is submerged into the fate of the community. The individual Israelite, who may have been totally virtuous, suffers from famine nonetheless, from God's imposed famine. Famine doesn't discriminate between individuals in a society. For the Jew, this sense of rugged individualism, as we have here in America, and the focus on the individual is a Protestant belief. For the Jew, the smallest unit is community. The individual's value is in what the individual contributes to the community. It's not self-fulfillment. Right? Now, if you're self-fulfilled, you have the potential to be of greater value to the community. And so it's not an ignoring of that fact, but at the end of the day, what's best for the community? The best example I can give you is the issue with masks. Okay? Right? If you think about what's being said, I have individual rights. That is a Protestant way of thinking. It is not a Jewish way of thinking. What is best for the community is that everybody wear a mask. Okay? All of this sense of the community gets shattered. It's shattered by the book of Job. The book of Job introduces to us two new elements into the picture. First, it highlights the fate of the individual human being. And second, it breaks completely with the doctrine of suffering as a divine retribution. Job doesn't seem to get what he deserves. Okay? I want you to identify with Job. I'm going to be the reader and you are Job. Okay? I, the reader, know from the outset why you are suffering. God's made this wager thing. You don't, as Job, and you never find out. You are taught to believe in a just and caring God who's not malicious. He doesn't toy with his creatures, and he only inflicts suffering as retribution for his sin. God's behavior is always predictable, and that's the basis upon which you have lived your life as Job. And suddenly, chaos breaks loose. Total suffering. Your children are killed, your possessions are destroyed, and you are afflicted head to toe with a severe skin ailment. You sit in mourning in an ash heap, scratching your skin. Your wife says to you, blaspheme God, curse God, and die, and you cannot. Okay? Here you sit in that suffering, and in your face walk your three friends who give you the traditional doctrine that is cause punishment for your sins, and your personal experience testifies against that. You may have had little sins along the way, but nothing that justifies the loss of your children and everything you own and your skin ailments, etc. Nothing, it's out of proportion. Okay? That's Job's dilemma. That's Job's problem. Suddenly, the traditional response doesn't work. The Bible's response doesn't work. Let's look at what God says to Job in this text. God tells Job, who are you to try to package me, to try to fit me into your human and moral categories? What kind of God would I be if you could understand me? I am God, and you're simply a human being. What seems to you to be good or evil, just or unjust, purposive or non-purposive, rational or irrational, are simply your own puny human conceptions. My reality transcends all of that. Don't try to take me to account and to make sense of my behavior. That's God's response in the book of Job. The ultimate nature, he's saying, and by implication, moral order, is beyond human comprehension. Now, Job emerges from this with a new perspective, both on God and human life. His answer in the book is, I have heard you with my ears, now I see you with my eyes. Somehow, out of what God has said, he's gained a new wisdom, a personal new experience, perhaps a wisdom that can't be learned without suffering. But I want to note for you, there's a non-theological character to God's response. It's a total denial of the possibility of theodicy, of making sense of God's justice. That's what God says you can't. All right? There's no explanation at the end of the day provided. Job emerges with no new knowledge, with no new facts about God. His new seeing, as he describes it, is paradoxically an acknowledgement that he can't see the ultimate makeup of creation. Only God has that vision. So what is it that reassures Job? Somehow he gets reassured by this response. And the answer is that I may not understand it, but that there is order in the universe. Maybe I can't understand it, but on some level it does exist. There is a sense making even if I can't make it. All right? It's more important that it exists than I understand it. And that is the response the rabbis have used. What do we say when someone dies? The blessing is Dayan Ha'emet. God is the true judge. What does that imply? I don't get it. I don't understand. But there must be some sense in this. God is the true judge. Now, I don't buy the theology, and we'll talk a little bit about this when I teach about Unetana Tokeb. I don't buy the theology of retribution in this, and there's a lot of reasons, but the reality of it is no one can convince me that the year my mom died, she had a really bad year. I'm not buying it. Okay? All right, so for me, that doesn't work. I had such a hard time spitting out the words Dayan Ha'emet. I said them and it was like choking on them. All right? And yet, that's all we have on that kind of situation. All right, let's go a little further. There's always more. Let's look post-biblical. Let's look at a rabbinic response. The Bible is filled with texts about national and universal dimensions of its eschatology. In other words, a discussion of the end of days. But it is totally silent about the fate of the individual human being after death. In the Bible itself, death is final. We'll spend a lot of time on this when we get to Michal Kel Chaim. But essentially, when death happens in the Bible, according to the Bible, there is no further existence. One loses connection to God. One loses connection to everything else that is dead. One loses connection to everything that exists. Death is death is death. Okay, that's the Bible's perspective. Two doctrines enter into Judaism which acquire dogmatic standing post-biblical times. One is the resurrection of the human body at the end of days, Mechayeh HaMetim, and the other is the immortality of the soul, that something exists beyond death. That is post-biblical. It really is a function of Persian beliefs, where we rejected the dualism, two gods. We bought into the existence of a soul beyond. And what that provides is if our relationship to God is not ended with death, then the framework is broadened and God has further opportunities to bring virtue and reward into line. Post-death promises, post-death rewards for the righteous, post-death punishments for the evil. All right, God's justice can remain intact in that world. By the way, just very briefly, it's not an accident. Think about what I just said. It comes from Persian beliefs. We bought the life of it. We bought the concept of eternal life from them. We rejected the dualism. That happened about 3 to 4 centuries before the Common Era. What does Christianity do? Because they emerged from Judaism 300 to 400 years later. They buy both. You create a devil. They bought both Persian beliefs, dualism and life after death. I mentioned to you last week that there's a special graveside Kaddish, and it begins with a paragraph that affirms this entire package of doctrines that has become normal in rabbinic Judaism. It says the following: may his great name be magnified and sanctified, that's the same as the beginning, in the world that is to be created anew. That is not in the traditional text, where he will revive the dead and raise them to eternal life. So these two beliefs that are post-biblical got written into the graveside Kaddish. All right. Taking it one step further, every form of Kaddish ends with the same affirmation. Oseh Shalom. May he who creates shalom in the heavens create shalom for us and all Israel. Now, we normally translate, as I said earlier, shalom is peace, but a more accurate description is shalem. It comes from the word completeness, is harmony and order and cosmos. It's the original Greek opposite of the word chaos. And if death represents the eruption of chaos, then we respond to that by reaffirming the facts of harmony and order. That's how we make sense. Okay? Death is chaos. Life exists beyond. There's order in the world because reward and punishment can exist in the next world. All right? That's one response. So our dilemma is clear. Let me play this out for you. Here's logic 101. Okay? If God is omnipotent, then God in some way has to be responsible for evil. If God is not responsible for evil, then God is not omnipotent. And evil exists independently of God, and then God's sovereignty is severely impaired. Okay? So by accepting God as omnipotent, we have said, and that is Jewish belief, we have said that God has to be responsible. Monotheism is so deeply ingrained within us, and dualism so greatly abhorred, that there's no way that evil could be allowed an independent reality on its own. That's what Isaiah's message was when he said, Uvoreed hara. All right, it's a denial of the potential for two gods. Okay, so our problem then is not one of God's omnipotence. Our problem is God's justice and benevolence. How do we make sense of that? And yet, at the same time, we'd like to play all the angles. God's goodness is so central a tenet to Judaism that when God seems to do something that doesn't make sense to us, we have the right to call God to account. Think of the story I mentioned to you before with Abraham. He turns to God and says to him, what kind of God of justice are you? For the sake of 50 people who might be good in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, you're going to destroy everybody? And God says, oh, all right, now maybe for the sake of 50. And Abraham doesn't take that. The chutzpah. He says 40, 30, 20, 10. He gets down to 10, and God says, all right, and God basically says, I'm done, and leaves. We're not going to talk 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. We're done to 10. All right, but the reality of it is, here we have a God who is saying, fight with me, and accepts it. All right, so where are we? We have this following, so far I've presented the following range of responses. The biblical view of retribution. God punishes in the collective. The rabbinic doctrine of individual eschatology, meaning reward and punishment post-life. The view that human freedom serves as evidence of God's self-determined limitation. God decides to limit himself so that human beings can have free will. And then, as presented in Job, God is beyond any attempt to understand. Dayan ha'emet. So we have 4 different responses so far. The 5th, I don't know how many of you read Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Mordecai Kaplan kind of presented this before him as well. Kushner had a son who died at the age of 14 and wrote a very personal response in his book. His book was not meant as a theology statement, it was meant as a personal response. And he counters the traditional inclination as God is responsible. He makes the following argument. As I said to you before, if we understand God as omnipotent and God as omniscient, that God knows everything, and God is good, this doesn't work. That's Kushner's argument. One of those 3 has to be flawed. He cannot accept a God who doesn't know everything, and he cannot accept a God who is not good. And so his response is what is known as limited theology, is that God does not have ultimate power. There are things that he has set the universe in order and has stepped back and cannot control certain things that happen. There's a leftover chaos from the creation that even God's impulse cannot control. All right? That's how he made sense of it. He's not the first to come up with a limited theology. He's just modern times popularized it. Okay? So that becomes a 5th. If God, what does God, and from that you see, oftentimes when they're suffering, what is God's response? You'll see a number of people say God cries with us. When suffering happens, God's presence is with us and cries with us. I want to go back a little bit to the biblical retribution theology. With the Holocaust, the problem of evil really acquired a new urgency. Maimonides argued that evil should be understood as only an absence of good, that there's nothing substantive to evil, it's just that good is missing. He would say we get shadows where the light doesn't enter. They're just shadows because the light can't get there, but the shadows have no substance of their own. They're the absence of light. When you look at the Holocaust, that no longer works. Plain and simply, it doesn't work. It's not something that is just the mere absence of good. All right? It dies. All right? Even as much as, when I'm not just giving you a conservative response, this is something Norman Lamb, who was the head of Yeshiva University, said. In the presence of the Holocaust, this concept of retribution theology has died. It cannot stand in its face. So when we look at the Holocaust, there are two groups of broad classes of responses. On a theological level, on a sheer philosophic level, it's one more instance of human cruelty, perhaps more massive, but not intrinsically different or posing new theological challenges. Theologically, philosophically, the death of 6 million and countless other human beings is not more problematic than the death of one innocent child on a philosophical, theological level. Both ask us to make sense of something that makes no sense. The second view sees the Holocaust as totally unprecedented. The sheer scope of the massacre, the malevolence with which it is perpetrated, the machine-like efficiency of the Nazi death camps, the active involvement and passive acquiescence of countless ordinary human beings, all of these factors, any of these factors, make the Holocaust unique. In this view, the resources that the tradition has provided for us are simply inadequate. But what has happened is, as I said to you, it has killed the doctrine of retribution as a response. The biblical response simply doesn't work. One more. Rubinstein. Rubinstein in the 60s spoke of the death of God. It is the most radical answer. As he said, we are living in a time of the death of God. This has echoes, even though he was Jewish, of Christian theological responses. All right? The very phrase, the death of God, is powerful for a Christian. The Christian God had to die in order to achieve his preordained mission. His death symbolizes God's parental identification with humanity and becomes an instrument for the vicarious remission of human sins. And it also includes an interim step, because ultimately resurrection will reoccur. Rubinstein's not buying that. That's not what he's saying. He is admitting that no human being actually can say that God really died. What he is saying that has died is our conception of God, our understanding of God, how we make sense of God in our universe. He claims that the way we have been functioning with God in our universe is no longer productive, and it no longer, particularly for Israel, works. Buber. Can't leave out Martin Buber. It's a requirement somewhere in every course on theology has to mention Buber somewhere along the way. Martin Buber is a contemporary Jewish thinker, last century. He answered the question, where is God? But in this time, by speaking of what he said was an eclipse of God. And it echoes the Bible's God hiding his face. That's what he's echoing. In the Bible, God is hiding his face most frequently as a form of retribution, but not always. Sometimes he's just gone. Sometimes, and Psalm 13 gives you an example of that, it represents what is sort of seems to be a mysterious ebb. This is what Buber is saying, a mysterious ebb in the divine-human relationship that we don't understand. We understand, we experience it as palpably real and terrifying, but we can't make sense of it. For Buber, this represents an inherent stage in the I-thou relationship. He would say to you that in all relationships, we know moments of intense intimacy and we know in moments of intense withdrawal. That is the nature of relationships. And therefore, Buber understands Job's experience as exactly that, as a withdrawing of God, as would happen in any relationship. And what is significant is not what God says to Job, but that he ultimately speaks to him again, that he returns to relationship with him. God ultimately turns back his face to Job. Job is not reassured by anything God says. He's reassured by God's presence. The evil is good, and God is good. And so the question becomes, how do we make sense of that? Buber's answer is, there are moments of God, just like in any relationship, stepping away. If you remember, this whole discussion began with Oseh Shalom, Uvorei et Hakol, who makes peace and creates everything, but it's really meant to say who creates the opposite of whatever Shalom is. And as a result, in the end, most theodicies, most understanding of God's justices are inaccurate. And that's why the book of Job was thrown into the text, because it's as if to say, we don't have any conclusive answers. We don't understand why human beings suffer. So here's another one, Dayan Hamet, we simply don't get it. I told you at the beginning I was going to give you answers. Therefore, by definition, no answer. So let's take off, let's unmute. You're welcome to unmute. I can promise you I won't have the answer, but I'm open to having discussions here. Anybody?
I'm reading a good book, though.
What you're reading?
Where's My Miracle?
Yeah.
Explaining Jewish traditions for dealing with tragedy.
Okay. Does it focus on any one of the ones that we presented?
No, I haven't finished reading the book, but I took a course from the author, and basically he says there are multiple traditions in Judaism, so it's a benefit because we can choose what makes sense for us.
Yeah, and we look, at the end of the day, we do. I would give you, just as an example, I'm very conflicted on the idea of an afterlife. Okay? I don't know that I believe. My mom dies, okay, and I'm left with a dilemma. Okay? Does this mean I will never see mom or have any relationship with mom again? And I've made up my mind that I'm going to believe. What does that mean? What does that mean? I don't know what that means. But I know that I'm going to hold on to that hope that I will see mom again. And at the end of the day, if I'm wrong and there's nothing, it doesn't matter. I won't see her again. Right? It's total rationalization.
No, that's what I figured is that, in response to my daughter dying, was faith is a choice. And you might as well choose something that makes your life easier. And maybe I'll understand it someday, but it's beyond me now, and I'm not in a hurry to understand it because I've got stuff to do here.
Yeah. So I've said it before, and I'll continue to say, this whole thing comes out of the prayer book. The prayer book is not a document of unimportant concepts. You are meant to confront this kind of issue every time you walk into the synagogue. It is there every single time you say the Shacharit service. It is the first thing, the call to worship. Right after you start the service, what is the first thing that comes out of your mouth? How do I deal with good and evil? There's a depth there. When people say the service doesn't speak to me, it's because they don't get it. Because if that issue doesn't speak to you, I don't know what does. Yes, Michelle.
You said that you couldn't stress something enough. And I didn't get down what it was about the Osa Shalom that you said you couldn't stress enough. It was toward the very, very beginning, about 11:05. You were saying something and you said you couldn't stress it enough. And then you were also explaining when we're supposed to sit down and then that was separating two different parts. Could you
yes, okay.
go back to
I don't remember, to be honest with you, I don't remember what I used the phrase, I can't stress it enough. So I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know what it is I said. The sitting, I can tell you. The Baruch Hu is a text unto itself. It's a call to worship. What follows is a blessing recognizing God as Yotzer, or as the former of light and darkness. It goes all the way until Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir V'Nizkech Hulanu, that God is the former of light. Right? It's about a 3-page blessing. So the blessing that follows the Baruch Hu is really part of the blessing that is part of that later section. It is not part of Baruch Hu. So the rabbis wanted you to know that. So since you stand for the Baruch Hu and you sit for the next section, they say sit for this blessing when you say it, to make sure that everybody understands it's not part of Baruch Hu.
So where does that start, that blessing that so when do you sit? After you say the Baruch Hu?
After you say Li'olam Va'ed. So you say Baruch Hu et, the leader says Baruch Adonai Barach. You say Baruch Adonai Barach Li'olam Va'ed, and then you sit. After you say Li'olam Va'ed yourself, you sit down.
And then what's the name of the prayer that follows that?
It's the blessing. It's the first blessing before the Shema. The God is creator. Sarah.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. All we've done is deal with one line today. We got more coming. Next week we'll continue on with the rest of this particular bracha, and I believe we'll deal with God as revealing, as God's love is revealed through Torah. I think that's where we'll get next week. All right. If there are no other questions, I certainly have no more answers. That's for sure. All right. I wish you all a good day. Stay healthy, and only good things.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Shalom.
Take care, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Here, take the book for the. Yeah. You'll stop.